The Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. When a traveler in north-central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork at the junction of the Aylesbury Pike, just beyond Dean Corners, he comes upon a lonely and curious country. The ground gets higher, and the briar-bordered stone walls press closer and closer against the ruts of the dusty, curving road. The trees of the frequent forest belt seem too large, and the wild weeds, brambles, and grasses attain a luxuriance not often found in settled regions. At the same time, the planted fields appear singularly few and barren, while the sparsely scattered houses wear a surprisingly uniform aspect of age, squalor, and dilapidation. Without knowing where, one hesitates to ask directions from the gnarled, solitary figures spied now and then on crumbling doorsteps or on the sloping, rock-strewn meadows. Those figures are so silent and furtive that one feels somehow confronted by forbidden things with which it would be better to have nothing to do. When a rise in the road brings the mountains in view above the deep woods, the feeling of strange uneasiness has increased. The summits are too rounded and symmetrical to give a sense of comfort and naturalness, and sometimes the sky silhouettes with especial clearness the queer circles of tall stone pillars with which most of them are crowned. Gorges and ravines of problematic depth intersect the way, and the crude wooden bridges always seem dubious safety. When the road dips again, there are stretches of marshland that one instinctively dislikes, and indeed almost fears at evening when unseen whippoorwills chatter and the fireflies come out in abnormal profusion to dance to the raucous, creepy, insistent rhythms of strident, piping bullfrogs. The thin, shining line of the Miskatonic upper reaches has an oddly serpent-like suggestion as it winds close to the feet of the domed hills among which it rises. As the hills draw nearer, one heeds their wooded sides more than their stone-crowned tops. Those sides loom up so darkly and precipitously that one wishes they would keep their distance. But there is no road by which to escape them. Across a covered bridge one sees a small village huddled between the stream and the vertical slope of Round Mountain, and wonders at the cluster of rotting gambrel roofs bespecking an earlier architectural period than that of the neighboring region. It is not reassuring to see, on a closer glance, that most of the houses are deserted and falling to ruin, and that the broken, steepled church now harbors the one slovenly mercantile establishment of the hamlet. One dreads to trust the tenebrous tunnel of the bridge, yet there is no way to avoid it. Once across, it is hard to prevent the impression of a faint malign order about the village street, as of the massed mold and decay of centuries. It is always a relief to get clear of the place, and to follow the narrow road around the base of the hills and across the level country beyond till it rejoins the Aylesbury Pike. Afterward, one sometimes learns that one has been through Dunwich. Outsiders visit Dunwich as seldom as possible, and since a certain season of horror, all the signposts pointing towards it have been taken down. The scenery, judged by an ordinary aesthetic canon, is more than commonly beautiful. Yet there is no influx of artists or summary tourists. 2 centuries ago, when talk of witch blood, Satan worship, and strange forest presences was not laughed at, it was the custom to give reasons for avoiding the locality. In our sensible age, since the Dunwich Horror of 1928 was hushed up by those who had the town's and the world's welfare at heart, people shun it without knowing exactly why. Perhaps one reason, though it cannot apply to uninformed strangers, is that the natives are now reputedly decadent, having gone far along the path of retrogression so common in many New England backwaters. They have come to form a race by themselves, with the well-defined mental and physical stigmata of degeneracy and inbreeding. The average of their intelligence is woefully low, whilst their annals reek of overt viciousness and of half-hidden murders, incests, and deeds of almost unnameable violence and perversity. The old gentry, representing the 2 or 3 amigurous families which come from Salem in 1692, have kept somewhat above the general level of decay, though many branches are sunk into the sordid populace so deeply that only their names remain as key to the origin they disgrace. Some of the Whateleys and Bishops still send their eldest sons to Harvard and Miskatonic, though these sons seldom return to the mouldering gambrel roofs under which they and their ancestors were born. No one, even those who have the facts concerning the recent horror, can say just what is the matter with Dunwich. Though old legends speak of unhallowed rites and conclaves of the Indians, amidst which they call forbidden shapes of shadow out of the great rounded hills, and made wild orgastic prayers that were answered by loud crackings and rumblings from the ground below. In 1747, the Reverend Abijah Hoadley, newly come to the Congregational Church at Dunwich village, preached a memorable sermon on the close presence of Satan and his imps, in which he said, "It must be allowed that these blasphemies of an infernal train of demons are matters of too common knowledge to be denied. The cursed voices of Azazel and Buzal, of Beelzebub and Belial, being heard now from underground by above a score of credible witnesses now living. I myself did not more than a fortnight ago catch a very plain discourse of evil powers in the hill behind my house, wherein there were a rattling and rolling, groaning, screeching, and hissing, such as no things of this earth could raise up, and which must needs have come from those caves that only black magic can discover, and only the devil unlock." Mr. Hoadley disappeared soon after delivering the sermon, but the text, printed from Springfield, is still extant. Noises in the hills continue to be reported from year to year, and still form a puzzle to geologists and physiographers. Other traditions tell of foul odors near the hill, crowning circles of stone pillars, and of rushing, airy presences to be heard faintly at certain hours from stated points, while still others try to explain the Devil's Hop Yard, a bleak, blasted hillside where no tree, shrub, or grass blade will grow. Then, too, the natives are mortally afraid of the numerous whippoorwills, which grow vocal on warm nights. It is vowed that the birds are psychopomps, lying in wait for the souls of the dying, and that they time their eerie cries in unison with the suffering struggling's breath. If they can catch the fleeing soul when it leaves their body, they instantly flutter away, chittering in demonic laughter. But if they fail, they subside gradually into a disappointed silence. These tales, of course, are obsolete and ridiculous, because they come down from very old times. Dunwich is indeed ridiculously old, older by far than any of the communities within 30 miles of it. South of the village one may still spy the cellar walls and chimney of the ancient Bishop House, which was built before 1700, whilst the ruins of the mill at the falls, built in 1806, form the most modern piece of architecture to be seen. Industry did not flourish here, and the 19th century factory movement proved short-lived. Oldest of all are the great rings of rough-hewn stone columns on the hilltops, but these are more generally attributed to the Indians than to the settlers. Deposits of skulls and bones found within these circles and around the sizable table-like rock on Sentinel Hill sustain the popular belief that such spots were once the burial places of the Pocumtucks, even though many ethnologists, disregarding the absurd improbability of such a theory, persist in believing that the remains are Caucasian. It was in the township of Dunwich, in a large and partly inhabited farmhouse, set against a hillside 4 miles from the village, and 1.5 miles from any other dwelling, that Wilbur Whately was born at 5 a.m. on Sunday, the 2nd of February, 1913. This date was recalled because it was Candlemas, which people in Dunwich curiously observe under another name, and because the noises in the hills had sounded, and all the dogs of the countryside had barked persistently throughout the night before. Less worthy of notice was the fact that the mother was one of the decadent Whatleys, a somewhat deformed, unattractive albino woman of 35, living with an aged and half-insane father, about whom the most frightful tales of wizardry had been whispered in his youth. Lavina Whately had no known husband, but according to the custom of the region made no attempt to disavow the child, concerning the other side of whose ancestry the country folk might and did speculate as widely as they chose. On the contrary, she seemed strangely proud of the dark, goatish-looking infant who formed such a contrast to her own sickly and pink-eyed albinism, and was heard to mutter many curious prophecies about its unusual powers and tremendous future. Lavina was one who would be apt to mutter such things, for she was a lone creature, given to wandering amidst thunderstorms in the hills, and trying to read the great odious books which her father had inherited through 2 centuries of Whatleys, and which were fast falling to pieces with age and wormholes. she had never been to school, but was filled with disjointed scraps of ancient lore that old Whatley had taught her. The remote farmhouse had always been feared because of old Whatley's reputation for black magic, and the unexplained death by violence of Mrs. Whatley when Lavina was 12 years old had not helped to make the place popular. Isolated among strange influences, Lavina was fond of wild and grandiose daydreams and singular occupations, nor was her leisure much taken up by household cares in a home from which all standards of order and cleanliness had long since disappeared. There was a hideous screaming which echoed above even the hill noises and the dogs barking on the night Wilbur was born, but no known doctor or midwife presided at his coming. Neighbors knew nothing of him till a week afterward, when old Whatley drove his sleigh through the snow into Dunwich village, and discoursed incoherently to the group of loungers at Osborne's general store. There seemed to be a change in the old man, an added element of furtiveness in the clouded brain, which subtly transformed him from an object to a subject of fear. Though he was not one to be perturbed by any common family event, amidst it all he shewed some trace of the pride later noticed in his daughter, and what he said of the child's paternity was remembered by many of his hearers years afterward. "I don't hear what folks think of Lavinia's boy. Looked like his pa. He wouldn't look like nothing you expect. You needn't think the only folks is the folks hereabouts. Lavinia's read some, and has seed some things that most of you only tell 'bout. I calculate her man is a good husband as you can find this side of Asbury. And if you know as much about the hills as I do, you wouldn't ask no better church wedding nor hin. Let me tell you something. Some day you folks'll hear child of Lavinia's a-callin' its father's name on the top of Sentinel Hill." The only person who saw Wilbur during the first months of his life were old Zachariah Whatley of the undecayed Whatleys, and Earl Sire's common-law wife, Mammy Bishop. Mammy's visit was frankly one of curiosity, and her subsequent tales did justice to her observations. But Zachariah came to lead a pair of Alderney's cows, which old Whatley had bought of his son Curtis. This marked the beginning of a course of cattle buying in the part of small Wilbur's family, which ended only in 1928, when the Dunwich Horror came and went. Yet at no time did the ramshackle Whatley barn seem overcrowded with livestock. There came a period when people were curious enough to steal up and count the herd that grazed precariously on the steep hillside above the old farmhouse, and they could never find more than 10 or 12 anemic, bloodless-looking specimens. Evidently some blight or distemper, perhaps sprung from the unwholesome pasturage, or the diseased fungi and timbers of the filthy barn, caused a heavy mortality amongst the Whatley animals. odd wounds or sores, having something of the aspect of incisions, seemed to inflict the visible cattle. And once or twice, during the earlier months, certain callers fancied they could discern similar sores about the throats of the grey, unshaven old man and his slatternly, crinkly-haired albino daughter. In the spring, after Wilbur's death, Lavinia resumed her customary rambles in the hills, bearing in her misproportioned arms the swarthy child. Public interest in the Watterleys subsided after most of the country folk had seen the baby, and no one bothered to comment on the swift development which that newcomer seemed every day to exhibit. Wilbur's growth was indeed phenomenal, for within 3 months of his birth he had attained a size and muscular power not usually found in infants under a full year of age. His motions, and even his vocal sounds, shrewd of restraint and deliberateness, highly peculiar in an infant, and no one was really unprepared when, at 7 months, he began to walk unassisted, with falterings which another mount which was sufficient to remove. It was somewhat after this time, on Halloween, that a great blaze was seen at midnight on the top of Sentinel Hill, where the old table-like stone stands amidst its tumulus of ancient bones. Considered talk was started when Silas Bishop, of the undecayed bishops, mentioned having seen the boy running sturdily up that hill ahead of his mother about an hour before the blaze was remarked. Silas was rounding up a stray heifer, but he nearly forgot his mission when he fleetingly spied the 2 figures in the dim light of his lantern. They darted almost noiselessly through the underbrush, and the astonished watcher seemed to think they were eerily unclothed. Afterward he could not be sure about the boy, who may have had some kind of a fringed belt and a pair of dark trunks or trousers on. Wilbur was never subsequently seen alive and conscious without complete and tightly buttoned attire. The disarrangement, or threatened disarrangement, of which always seemed to fill him with anger and alarm. His contrast with his squalid mother and grandfather in this respect was thought very notable until the horror of 1928 suggested the most valid of reasons. The next January, gossips were mildly interested in the fact that Lavini's black brat had commenced to talk, and at the age of only 11 months. His speech was somewhat remarkable, both because of its difference from the ordinary accents of the region, and because it displayed a freedom from infantile lisping of which many children of 3 or 4 might well be proud. The boy was not talkative, yet when he spoke, he seemed to reflect some elusive element wholly unpossessed by Dunwich and its denizens. The strangeness did not reside in what he said, or even in the simple idioms he used, but seemed vaguely linked with his intonation, of which the internal organs that produce the spoken sounds. His facial aspects, too, was remarkable for its maturity, for though he shared his father's and grandfather's chinliness, his firm and precociously shaped nose united with the expressions of his large, dark, almost Latin eyes, to give him an air of quasi-adulthood and well-nigh preternatural intelligence. He was, however, exceedingly ugly, despite his appearance of brilliancy, there being something almost goatish or animalistic about his thick lips, large-pored, yellowish skin, coarse, crinkly hair, and oddly elongated ears. He was soon disliked even more decidedly than his mother and grandsire, and all conjectures about him were spiced with references to the bygone magic of old Watterley, and how the hills once shook when he shrieked the dreadful name of Yog-Sothoth in the midst of a circle of stones, with a great book open in his arms before him. Dogs abhorred the boy, and he was always obliged to take various defensive measures against their barking menace. Meanwhile, old Watterley continued to buy cattle without a measurable increasing in the size of his herd. He also cut timber and began to repair the unused parts of his house, a spacious, peaked-roofed affair, whose rear end was buried entirely in the rocky hillside, and whose 3 less ruined ground-floor rooms had always been sufficient for himself and his daughter. There must have been prodigious reserves of strength in the old man to enable him to accomplish so much hard labor, and though he still babbled dementedly at times, his carpentry seemed to shew the efforts of sound calculation. It had already begun as soon as Wilbur was born. When one of the many tool sheds had been put suddenly in order, clapboarded, and fitted with a stout, fresh lock. Now, in restoring the abandoned upper story of the house, he was no less thorough craftsman. His mania shewed itself only in his tight boarding up of all the windows in the reclaimed section, though many declared that it was a crazy thing to bother with the reclamation at all. Less inexplicable was his fitting up of another downstairs room for his new grandson, a room which several callers saw, though no one was ever admitted to the closely boarded upper story. This chamber he lined with tall, firm shelving, along which he began gradually to arrange, in apparently careful order, all the rotting ancient books and parts of books which during his own day had been heaped promiscuously in odd corners of the various rooms. "I made some use of 'em," he would say, as he tried to mend a torn black-letter page with paste prepared on the rusty kitchen stove. "But the boy is fitting to make better use of 'em. He oughter hear adverts as well as sort as he can, for going to be old of his larning." When Wilbur was 1 year and 7 months old, in the September of 1914, his size and accomplishments were almost alarming. He had grown as large as a child of 4, and was fluent and incredibly intelligent talker. He ran freely about the fields and hills, and accompanied his mother on all of her wanderings. At home he would pore diligently over the queer pictures and charts in his grandfather's books, while old Watterley would instruct and catechize him through long hushed afternoons. By this time the restoration of the house was finished, and those who watched it wondered why one of the upper windows had been made into a solid plank door. It was a window in the rear of the east gabled end, close against the hill, and no one could imagine why a cleated wooden runway was built up to it from the ground. About the period of this work's completion, people noticed that the old tool-house, tightly locked and windowlessly clappered since Wilbur's birth, had then been abandoned again. The door swung listlessly open, and when Earl Sawyer once stepped within after a cattle-selling call on Old Watley, he was quite decomposed by the singular order he had encountered. Such a stench, he averred, as he had never before smelt in all his life, except near the Indian circles on the hills, and which could not come from anything sane or of this earth. But then the homes and sheds of Dunwich folk had never been remarkable for olfactory immaculateness. The following months were void of visible events, save that everyone swore to a slow but steady increase in the mysterious hill noises. On May, the eve of 1915, there were tremors which even the Aylesbury people felt, whilst the following Halloween produced an underground rumbling, queerly synchronized with bursts of flame, from Witch Watley's doing, from the summit of Sentinel Hill. Wilbur was growing up uncannily, so that he looked like a boy of 10 as he entered his 4th year. He read avidly by himself now, but talked much less than formerly. A settled taciturnity was absorbing him, and for the first time people began to speak specifically of the dawning look of evil in his goatish face. He would sometimes mutter an unfamiliar jargon, and chant in bizarre rhymes, which chilled the listener with a sense of unexplainable terror. The aversion displayed toward him by dogs had now become a matter of wide remark, and he was obliged to carry a pistol in order to traverse the countryside in safety. His occasional use of the weapon did not enhance his popularity amongst the owners of the canine guardians. The few callers at the house would often find Lavinia alone on the ground floor, while odd cries and footsteps resounded in the boarded-up second story. She would never tell what her father and the boy were doing up there, though once she turned pale and displayed an abnormal degree of fear when a jocose fish peddler tried the locked door leading to the stairway. That peddler told the store loungers at Dunwich village that he thought he heard a horse stamping on the floor above. The loungers reflected, thinking of the door and runway, and of the cattle that so swiftly disappeared. Then they shuddered as they recalled tales of old Watley's youth, and of the strange things that are called out of the earth when a bullock is sacrificed at the proper time to certain heathen gods. It had for some time been noticed that dogs had begun to hate and fear the whole Watley place as violently as they hated and feared young Wilbur personally. In 1917, the war came, and Squire Sawyer Watley, as chairman of the local draft board, had hard work finding a quota of young Dunwich men fit even to be sent to a development camp. The government, alarmed at such signs of wholesale regional decadence, sent several authors and medical experts to investigate, conducting a survey which New England newspaper readers may still recall. It was the publicity attending this investigation which sent reporters on the track of the Watterleys, and caused the Boston Globe and Arkham Advertiser to print flamboyant Sunday stories of young Wilbur's precociousness. Old Watterly's black magic, the shelves of strange books, the sealed second story of the ancient farmhouse, and the weirdness of the whole region and its hill noises. Wilbur was 4.5 then, and looked like a lad of 15. His lips and cheeks were fuzzy with a coarse dark down, and his voice had begun to break. Earl Sawyer went out to the Watterly place with both sets of reporters and cameramen, and called their attention to the queer stench which now seemed to trickle down from the sealed upper spaces. It was, he said, exactly like a smell he had found in the tool shed abandoned when the house was finally repaired, and like the faint odors which he sometimes thought he caught near the stone circles on the mountain. Dunwich folk read the stories when they appeared, and grinned over the obvious mistakes. They wondered, too, why the writers made so much of the fact that old Watterly always paid for his cattle in gold pieces of extremely ancient date. The Watterleys had received their visitors with ill-concealed distaste, though they did not dare court further publicity by a violent resistance or a refusal to talk. For a decade the annals of the Watterly sink indistinguishably into the general life of a morbid community used to the queer ways and hardened to their Merry Eve and All-Hallow orgies. Twice a year they would light fires on the top of Sentinel Hill, at which times the mountain rumblings would recur with great and greater violence, while at all seasons there were strange and portentous doings at the lonely farmhouse. In the course of time, callers professed to hear sounds in the sealed upper story, even when all the family were downstairs, and they wondered how swiftly or how lingeringly a cow or bullock was usually sacrificed. There was a talk of a complaint to the Society for the Preservation of Cruelty to Animals, but nothing ever came of it. Such Dunwich folk are never anxious to call the outside world's attention to themselves. About 1923, when Wilbur was a boy of 10, whose mind, voice, stature, and bearded face gave all the impression of maturity, a second great siege of carpentry went on at the old house. It was all inside the sealed upper part, and from bits of discarded lumber, people concluded that the youth and his grandfather had knocked out the partitions and even removed the attic floor, leaving only one vast open void between the ground story and the tall peaked roof. They had torn down the great central chimney, too, and fitted the rusty range with a flimsy outside tin stovepipe. In the spring after this event, old Watterly noticed the growing number of whippoorwills that would come out of Cold Spring Glen to chirp under his window at night. He seemed to regard the circumstance as one of great significance, and told the loungers at Osborne's that he thought his time had almost come. "They whistle just in tune with my breathing now," he said.
And I guess they're getting ready to catch me so. They know it's going about, and don't calculate to miss it. Y'all know, boys, after I'm gone whether they get me or not. If they do, they'll keep up a singing and laughing till break of day. If they don't, they'll kinder quiet down like, except them on the souls they hunts for have some pretty tough tussles sometimes.
On Lammas night, 1924, Dr. Horton of Aylesbury was hastily summoned by Wilbur Watterly, who had lashed his one remaining horse through the darkness and telephoned from Osborne's in the village. He found old Watterly in a grave state, with a cardiac action and stertorous breathing that told of an end not far off. The shapeless albino daughter and oddly bearded grandson stood by the bedside, whilst from the vacant abyss overhead there came a disquieting suggestion of rhythmical surging or lapping, as of the waves on some level beach. The doctor, though, was chiefly disturbed by the chattering night-birds outside, a seemingless, limitless legion of whippoorwills that cried their endless message in a repetitiously timed diabolically to the wheezing gasps of the dying man. It was uncanny and unnatural. Too much, thought Dr. Horton, like the whole of the region he had entered so reluctantly in response to the urgent call. Toward 1 o'clock, old Watterly gained consciousness, and interrupted his wheezing to choke out a few words to his grandson. "More space, Willie, more space soon. You grows, and that grows faster. You'll be ready to sarve you soon, boy. Open up the gates to Yog Sotho with the long chant you'll find on page 751 of the complete edition, and then put a match to the prison. Fire from us can't burn it anyhow." He was obviously quite mad. After a pause, during which the flock of the whippoorwills outside adjusted their cries to the altered tempo, while some indications of the strange hill noises came from afar off, he added another sentence or two.
"Feed it regular, Willie, and mind the quantity, but don't let it grow too fast to place, for if it bursts quarters or gets out before you opens the Yog Sotho, it's all over and no use. Only them from beyond can make it multiply and work. Only them. The old ones wants to come back."
But speech gave place to gasps again, and Lavinia screamed at the way the whippoorwills followed the change. It was the same for more than an hour, when the final throaty rattle came. Dr. Horton drew shrunken lids over the glazing grey eyes as the tumult of birds faded impeccably to silence. Lavinia sobbed, but Wilbur only chuckled whilst the hill noises rumbled faintly. "They didn't get him," he muttered in his heavy bass voice.